Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News, and today we have Professor Shawn Wong, who is the author for Homebase and American Needs. Professor Shawn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Tell us about your passion on creative writing, and why is it that it is so important in today's world?
Writers are, I don't know if I can comment on why it's important to today's world, but I know why it's important to me. I have to, I've always wanted to, express myself in an artistic way. Some people are painters or musicians, or I've always wanted to write. I can't think of any other medium that I remember. There's a funny quote by George O'Keeffe, painter. They asked her, when did you realize you wanted to be a painter? And her answer was, I don't know. Because it was always there, right? There's no sort of, I think, initial point where she decided I wanted to be a painter. And for me, it was the same way. I think I always wanted to be a writer. When I was in school, I was at University of California, Berkeley, and I remember one day thinking to myself, what do I really want to be? And I thought I should try to be what I really want to be first, and then if I fail, then I'll do something else, right? So I decided that I wanted to be a writer. And I had been writing, I was about 20 years old, and I've been writing my own poetry and fiction for a couple of years. And I realized two things right away. As soon as I decided I wanted to be a writer, I realized two things. One, I wasn't a very good writer. I could get better, which is always a good thing to know if you're an artist. And number two, I suddenly realized that I was the only Asian American writer I knew in the entire world. Think about that.
Wow.
No,
which year was that?
This was probably 1969.
Wow.
And no teacher in high school or college had ever assigned a book by an Asian American author, and no teacher had ever even mentioned a book by an Asian American author. And so I think it was really an interesting feeling, realizing that you were the only one and that there was no model. I knew they must be out there, but no teacher had ever even uttered the name of an Asian American writer. So I decided, well, I can't be the only one. I didn't even know, there weren't even any young guys, young students my age who were Asian who were writing. I didn't even know them, I didn't even know unpublished Asian American writers. And so, and my African American friends, they could recite the whole history of African American literature in the United States. You could take classes in African American literature when I was in school in the late 60s and early 70s. And I thought, well, there must be a parallel literary history. That Asian Americans, Chinese Americans have been in the United States for 150 years. I figured somebody must have written something, a poem, a novel, a collection of short stories, something. So I started to look, and in fact I decided, I was an English major at the time, I decided I would major in Asian American literature, except there were no teachers, no classes, no grades, no credit. I just decided it was my research subject, and which is something I think that is really unusual for a young student. You go to this enormous university, University of California, Berkeley, and you discover a subject nobody teaches at that school. Not only do they not teach it, none of my professors even knew anything about it. And so I decided, well, I have to research this, and they're not going to be able to help me. And so eventually, to make a long story short, I eventually met other young writers, Frank Chin, Jeff Chan, Losni Nada. And in 1974, we published the first anthology of Asian American literature, i.e., which next year will be 40 years old. And I think it's really interesting that the research for that book came out in 1974. The research for that book started when I was an undergraduate. We pretty much finished the manuscript for that anthology when I was a senior at the University of California, Berkeley. And at the time, I was just trying to find the generation of writers that came before me, who wrote about Chinatown, wrote about Manila Town, or being in Japanese American camps, things like that. And I didn't set out as a young student to what became, identifying the canonical works of Asian American literature. That never even occurred to me. I said, well, here are the writers, that came before me, and their work should be recognized, that their work should be rediscovered, because they're part of my literary history. Just as a young African American writer would point to Langston Hughes and James Baldwin, all these older generation writers that were a part of their literary history. And so, that's sort of how I got started. It wasn't enough most young writers, it wasn't enough just to, write your own novel and take care of your own career. What I found myself doing as in my early 20s was taking care of the careers of writers whose writing careers were neglected and forgotten and were obscure, and bringing their work back into prominence. Not because, I felt, I don't know, not because I had any sense as a 20-year-old of, I'm going to make my mark on literary scholarship. I just thought, I found these books and I read them and they're great books and other people should read them. and that led to the first anthology. I didn't set out to become a literary scholar. I just wanted to write my books.
An offer by accident.
Yes.
And so what does it mean, to be a Chinese American diaspora, today? And as well as you started, as a pioneer for Asian American studies. How important is it at that time and in today's context as we move along towards the future?
Yeah, and I think it's very important. When I was a young student, there was no Asian American studies. There weren't even any books. When I set out to find these books, there were none of the books were in print. They were all out of print, and there was no Asian American studies. Asian American studies or ethnic studies as a field was just starting to begin. And luckily for me, I was in school at a time when ethnic studies was just starting, and I got involved with something called Asian American Studies. And a lot of the very first teachers were students themselves, and we all sort of discovered the curriculum together. The students and the teachers. And I started teaching in college when I was 22 years old, and there wasn't much difference between me and the students. we were sort of mutually discovering the curriculum ourselves, and finding new books, Asian American literary research in those days, anyone could stumble upon a new book, that had been published and no one had rediscovered yet. So it was an interesting field to be in, and to be in a field of literature that was completely neglected and forgotten. And it was important to me. I was an English major at UC Berkeley, which was a very conservative major. It was, did British authors. And that's all we read. And when I came out of school, one thing to realize about a writer is, that we're readers, and that's where we start our careers. And when I came out of school, I wanted to read writers who were still alive. I wanted to read women writers, I wanted to read African Americans and Hispanic American writers and Native American writers, and I wanted to meet them. And luckily, growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can meet these writers, and I got to know as a young 19-year-old, I got to know a lot of writers who became friends, and a lot of times none of them had published books then. So I met a lot of published authors like Ishmael Reed and Alex Haley, who wrote Roots, and then there were unpublished writers like Leslie Marmon Silko, and other young writers who were sort of my generation, who were just beginning. And so it wasn't just Asian American writers that I was trying to meet and form, but I was also meeting these other sort of multicultural, writers who are contributing to multicultural literature, and that was sort of my group. And after the anthology came out, after IE, the anthology came out, we published. We also organized the very first Asian American Writers Conference at the Oakland Museum in 1975, the year after our anthology came out, in which we brought every living Asian American author to Oakland, California, to the Oakland Museum, and staged the largest conference of Asian American writers ever held, and still today the largest conference of Asian American writers in one spot. We brought, pioneer writers whose works were being rediscovered by young people like me, as well as new writers. So it was a very exciting time. At the time, though, we weren't thinking about the diaspora, and I think in recent years, more of our research has been extending, outside the U.S. And realizing that we also can add to our voice by discovering other, particularly other other writers of Asian ancestry who write in English from around the Pacific Rim, and other countries. I was at a conference in Hong Kong many years ago, about a decade ago, in which they brought together writers of Chinese ancestry who write in English from all over the world. And it was really an eye-opening experience. Writers from New Zealand and Australia and Malaysia and Singapore and the UK, and we had a conversation about, not only our common themes that we work with in our literatures, but also it was a great gathering of writers of Chinese ancestry, from around the world, particularly the Pacific Rim, Hong Kong, and all along Southeast Asia, etc.
Is there a great need to gather all these stories of the past, especially the Chinese ancestry category?
Yeah, I think it's very important. Along with when you study any literature, you have to have you have to also know the the social history of its people too and its community. And when I published my novel Homebase, it's not only semi-autobiographical, but also it's about the history of Chinese America. And I thought in order for readers, there were no Chinese American novels. They're very at that time when it came out in 1979. It was the only Chinese American novel by a Chinese American male in print in America. So, it was up to me, I think, to not only sort of tell my story, but also try to inform the readers as to what my history was, and where did Chinese Americans come from, and what did they do in America.
How many generations are there for in Chinese history that has already evolved and grown in the United States?
Yeah, so the Chinese started coming to America in big numbers right after the California Gold Rush in 1850. Right? So Chinese have been coming. First came to America in the 19th century. They worked in the gold. People from all over the world were coming to California. They thought they could just pick up gold off the ground, and the Chinese, the Chinese called America Gamsan, Gold Mountain, and along with every other immigrant from all over the world were coming and trying to get rich, and then later in the after that was over, then the Chinese, built the Transcontinental Railroad across America. So, they're embedded in the history of America.
Was there any way in history that the Chinese were also involved in the Civil War? Do they have any hand in it?
There's some researchers have discovered pictures of Chinese immigrants who were in militias. I know some historians in Oregon have discovered pictures of Chinese immigrants in Oregon militia uniforms. And it's very interesting, But they were certainly here during the Civil War, and not too many lived in the South. A lot of the first Chinese immigrants who came to America were skilled laborers, and particularly in the West, where they needed a lot of skilled workers.
And these Chinese who are immigrants, are they coming from the southern part of China or the northern part of China?
Mostly from Guangdong province. So a lot of them were agricultural. They were farmers, poor people. Many of them were illiterate. They couldn't read or write, and so. So they fit in, in terms of the labor market of miners and railroad workers and things like that in the 19th century. And a lot of that history was lost. And in the early 1970s, young Chinese American historians started to research the subject and start to rediscover that history and reintroduce that history.
Moving forward, as you have written this book, Home-Based, how important is this book to you? And which part of the chapter of the book actually defines the Chinese history as well as yourself that's touched your very soul and your life?
Well, I think it's very much like a novel that's an author's first novel, in that it's highly autobiographical, even though it's a fiction. The main character is a young man who is a fourth generation Chinese American, but I'm only second generation. My parents both came from China. But one of the things that I wanted to do in this novel was to write about Chinese American history that seemed so neglected. And in the novel, the young man is an orphan. His mother and father have died at a young age, and he finds himself sort of in the same position as the original immigrant who came over, great-grandfather who came over to America, as a sort of single man who is here without his parents and is a laborer. And so the main character in my novel finds himself in the fictional world, finds himself sort of the same age as his great-grandfather. And the history of Chinese in California is kind of told through the sort of the fictional premise that he finds himself in the novel working alongside his great-grandfather, and then being the same age as his grandfather, and then being the same age as his father. And in order to sort of rediscover their lives and to bear witness to their history in America by walking alongside them. So the premise is, obviously highly experimental, but I thought it was the easiest way for me to connect with that history, or to make that history kind of come alive rather than just cite a lot of statistics. Or
What is the inspiration behind the book Homebase, and how is it that changed you and the way you perceive yourself as a Chinese American today?
Yeah, and I think we like the story I told you earlier about not knowing any Asian American writers or Chinese American writers. The other thing that wasn't known to me was Chinese American history at all. No one taught it in school. And I remember my mother saying to me, she said, when I was very young, she says, "You're Chinese American, you're born in America." And she said, "That makes you different from us, because my parents both came from China in the 1940s as students at Berkeley." And I didn't understand what she was talking about, but later, you realize that you have a different history, you have a different culture. You come to the language differently than they did. They were lucky in the sense that they came to America both as students, so they read and wrote in English already. They went to missionary schools, and so it wasn't sort of the typical immigrant story. But they both died very young. Both my parents died when they were 40 years old. My father died when I was 7, and my mother died when I was 15. And so I think one of the things that I was looking for in Homebase was just to kind of retell their story, too, and to try to, in some ways, pay homage for the lives they did live, even though they passed away very young. And so the novel, is for them. And, even though a lot of it's fiction, some of the facts are true, but a lot of it is, I had to change the character into a fourth-generation Chinese American. So it feels very autobiographical, and people always ask me, or always assume that I'm fourth-generation Chinese American, which is, I think, a compliment to the author that you can create this world that feels very real.
Professor Shawn, welcome back to the National Great Stories. Please tell us who were your mentors that helped you form this wonderful book, Homebase.
So My main mentor in graduate school, and actually in undergraduate school, was Kay Boyle. She taught at San Francisco State, and when I was in graduate school, I had the fortunate experience of being able to live with her too, as well as have her as my mentor. It was sort of a true sort of classic apprentice, master kind of arrangement. In the old days when you wanted to be a blacksmith, you went and worked with the blacksmith, and you lived in their house, and I did the same thing. Kay was in her 60s then. She had this large Victorian mansion in Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, which was a wonderful place to live, and she rented out rooms in her house, and she had her own separate apartment upstairs, and so I had the good fortune of having access to my teacher 24 hours a day, which is, and there's a downside too, because it meant she had 24-hour access to me, and I got something that you never get in school, which is it's one thing to learn how to be a writer and have a good teacher, but I was able to observe by living with her how to live your life as a writer, how to live the literary life. And she was a young writer in Paris in the 1920s, so she knew Hemingway and Joyce and all these people, Gertrude Stein. If you look at the old photographs of Paris in the 1920s, she's sitting there with all the authors, and she was in her early 20s at that time, and writing. I remember one day coming home, and I was checking the mail in the front, checking the mail that day, and she came down from her apartment, and I put my books down on the table that I was reading for a class, and she looked at the book on top, which was The Dubliners by James Joyce, and she said, "Oh, I see you're reading Jim's book." "Jim? You mean James Joyce?" And she goes, "Yeah, I knew James Joyce." And she says, "There's letters from him downstairs in the filing cabinet." And she goes, "You can read them." And downstairs in the filing cabinet were letters from not only James Joyce, but Samuel Beckett and William Carlos Williams, and all these iconic writers that I studied in school. And she knew them. She regularly corresponded with Samuel Beckett. She let me read letters whenever they arrived from him. And it was quite an experience to be able to live in that sort of literary household. And writers were writers and artists and all kinds of people were always coming through the front door. So it was a great educational experience. And the interesting thing is, I graduated in 1974, but she remained my teacher for her entire life. She died in 1992 at the age of 92, and she remained my teacher the entire time. She always read my work and commented on it, and long after I was her student. So when I wrote Homebase, I sent her the manuscript, and she sent me, which I still have, she sent me detailed, handwritten notes on my novel. Pages and pages of notes on things I should consider, when I started to revise it.
And that's why your book won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award, as well as the 15th Annual Governor's Writers' Day Award of Washington. And it's remarkable for a first book.
Thank you.
And for your second novel, American Knees, it was first published in 1996, and it went and became an independent feature film entitled American Knees in 2010, written and directed by Eric Baylor. and produced by Lisa Onodira.
Yeah.
Now, why is it so unique about this book, American Knees? And what inspired you to come up with this title? Why do you call it American Knees?
American Knees is explained right in the beginning of the book, but the book is American Knees is a romantic comedy about race and ethnicity and racial stereotypes, and I wanted to kind of poke fun at all the stereotypes, not only sort of typical media kinds of stereotypes that we see all the time, but also stereotypes Asians have of other Asians and things like that often don't get mentioned. But I just wanted to write this broad comedy, and so the very first thing that happens in the book is the main character, Raymond Ding, thinks back on his first recollection of race when he was a young boy. And the first thing he heard was this kind of schoolyard chant where non-Asian kids would come up to him and say, "What are you? Chinese, Japanese, or American knees?" You know, and they would go like this, you know, Chinese, Japanese, you know, American knees. The other version of it is Chinese, Japanese, or dirty knees. You know, it's not. It was a very, you know, it was a sort of schoolyard racism, and so that's the explanation of the title.
And how does this book that you've written overcome racial segregations among ethnic groups?
You know, I think it's sort of like what it attempts to do is by poking fun at racial stereotypes. Often, you know, a lot of these are just sort of stereotypes that non-Asians, you know, believe in. You know, and so one of the ways to make people, I think, more culturally literate is to use comedy. Stand-up comedians often use racism as a source for their comedy, and by the end of their stand-up routine, the audience actually learns something about racism, right? They might learn something that, oh, you know, the comedian might be pointing out something that somebody in the audience actually does that they didn't think was racist but is racist, and so I do the same thing. I try to point out not only very obvious things, but very subtle things too that might happen within a family. What do you do when you have a family member who says something racist? Do you say something, or do you keep quiet, or you know, or you have an older member of the family who says something racist? And so I think one of the things that I try to do in the book, and as well as in the movie, is to make issues of race and racism not so absolute, but really kind of explore the subtler aspects of racism as well. At the same time, you know, it's a romantic comedy. It's quite funny, it's something that you know, as writers give themselves assignments, and the assignment I gave myself was a couple of things. I wanted to write a comedy. You know, I think comedy is the hardest thing to write, you know, because you're actually trying to make the reader laugh out loud. That was my goal. Can I write something and make the reader laugh out loud, right?
And what is good comedy?
Yeah, well, you have to have good timing. You know, it's exactly like being a stand-up comedian, except you have to put your timing on the page. And I remember that when I was working on the book and I would do readings, I would accept readings and I would go and read parts of the book. But I remember, even though I've done lots of readings and I'm not nervous at all, I remember being extremely nervous because I was just like a stand-up comedian. I said, okay, I'm going to read this funny section. People better laugh. If they don't laugh, I fail. And I remember reading and testing the sections in a book out on people to see if they would laugh, and luckily they did.
So, my viewers like to know, why did it take you so long to write your next book?
I haven't written I've only written 2 novels, but I've written several other things in between, And one of the things that I like to do as an author is I like to work on other different forms too. So I've published 6 other anthologies of writing in between, and because I'm still dedicated to bringing Asian American and multicultural literature, to readers and to students. I'm a professor. I've been a professor for 42 years. So a lot of the things that I've been publishing are books that can be used in the class, books that can be used in my own class. And I've also been writing screenplays, and I'm working on another novel right now. But it's not important for me to write a novel just for the sake of writing a novel. I think, as you can see from my novels, I try to do something very, very different each time. And I always say, because I teach Asian American literature, I'm always trying to write the book that fills the gap. Right? Homebase filled the gap. When I wrote American Knees, there was not a single book out in Asian American literature that talked about that was a comedy. That in fact, my students often complained before American Knees came out that every single book in Asian American literature is depressing.
Or boring.
Or boring, or about grandma arriving in America. Come on, let's move up a few generations, right? And that immigrant story is getting old, and not that there's anything wrong with it. So that's what I decided to do. I try to fill the gap, and it's interesting you talk about diaspora. My next novel goes in to explore the diaspora. It's about a main character, Asian American, who for the most part doesn't. The life I described that he lives isn't even in America. It's in Europe and Asia, and so I felt that the next novel needs to reach out to the understanding the diaspora, through this one character. He's Asian American businessman, and the Asian American businessman is ubiquitous in the world. You stand in any airport, and we're all over the place. Our gray suits. We look anonymous now. There's so many of us, and so this new novel is about that anonymity.
And so, Professor Shawn Wong, could you tell us about the Asian American writer scene in the United States in the past, present, and what has it come for the future? And could you share with us what is creative writing? Does creative writing meaning that we should take our own time to write at our own pace to create the gaps, as you have said?
Well, that's what creative writing is for me. Is writing the books that I have the luxury. I have a full-time job, so I don't really need to support myself through my writing. But so I always try to think of something that doesn't really respond to the marketplace at all, but is something that not only serves what I want to say, but also will give something to broaden broaden the landscape of Asian American literature. And that's important to me, to be able to contribute something to the landscape of Asian American literature, because that's how I got started, was establishing and rediscovering Asian American literature. So I always want to be able to add something, to that. So that's important, number one. And I also have the luxury now of there are lots of Asian American writers publishing. There's not just me. And there's a lot of young writers who are great young writers. There's since the 70s now, there's 2 or 3 generations of Asian American writers who are publishing, and they're doing great work. And it's much more diverse than it once was. When I started writing, it was only Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino American writers. And now that the Asian American writing scene is South Asians and Southeast Asians.
What advice would you give to young writers or aspiring authors, in this part of the world, in Asia or even in Europe and elsewhere? What kind of advice would you give for those who wish to aspire in your footsteps?
I think that one thing that I think can help is that they need to be aware of the literary history that came before them. They need to read extensively. In order to be a writer, you need to read. And so I think they need to read not only the Asian writers of Asian ancestry that are from their own area, but also the diaspora of Asian writers around the world. Because your work is going to be discussed in relationship with that, with that literary history. And so it's good to know, and it was always served me well to know how my books fit in, and you can tell, as a writer, I can tell by reading another Asian author's work who they've read. It's kind of like a jazz musician can listen to another jazz musician and say, oh, that person is classically trained, and they can tell by the technique. So when I read an author like Fei Eng, a Chinese-American author, when I read her books, I can tell what she knows about Chinese-American literary history just by reading, some of the references that she makes in her book. And so, that's my advice.
Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Voice Online News, and folks, thank you for joining me here again. Professor Shawn Wong will be sharing with us a reading from his book, Homebase. Professor Wong.
Okay, this is from the first chapter, and this is a little bit about the main character, Rainsford Chan, and his great-grandfather. It's pretty self-explanatory. Takes place in California. I am the son of my father, my grandfathers, and I have a story to tell about my history, about a moment in the Pacific when I heard myself saying, ever yours. Ever is a word that moves like a song, exposing the heart in its tone, never hiding, never patronizing. The word speaks directly, creates form, and has its own voice. Great-grandfather built the railroad through the Sierra Nevada in difficult seasons. Night was a time of peace. On warm nights, great-grandfather would move away from camp to sleep, away from the night workers. There was a river nearby the camp, and farther upstream the falls. He always walked beside the moonlit river at night, the cascading water glowing white with a reflection made his footsteps visible. And in the windless night he crossed warm pockets of night air, then cool dark spots. But as he moved closer to the sound of the falls, the night air became moist and only cool. His skin tasted the air. It was an uphill hike to the base of the falls. Excuse me. It was an uphill hike to the base of the falls and a steeper climb to the top, where he rested, looking down on the fires of camp. He climbed on large granite stones to reach the top of the falls. He began to sweat. The mist from the crashing falls soaked him and mixed with his sweat. The noise was relief from the railroad iron noise of the day. He rested for a moment, looking down into the river's valley. The water appeared vague, uncertain, became the sound of moonlight, rather than the sound of water rushing through the valley. The moonlit mist carved valleys out of the granite, not the river. The moon made sounds in great-grandfather's eyes, made the mist from the falls look like gray smoke floating down the valley, washing out all the details of the canyon walls, losing its night walker in its movement, cooling his exhaustion, and leaving him dreaming a moan out of all his years of living. But he always woke from that easy rest and demanded that the tradition he passed on be more than a dream and moan of breath. It was his own voice. Okay, American Knees is a romantic comedy, and one of the interesting things about working on American Knees is I wanted to write a novel that was more about how a couple separates rather than how they first meet, the sort of typical boy meets girl kind of story. And one of the things I wanted to explore in this romance was the couple meet, they fall in love, and then right at the beginning of the book they split up. And so the book explores not only why they split up, but how difficult it is sometimes to leave someone. And the other reason I wrote the book was my late wife, Vicki. She said to me one day, we were getting ready to go on a trip, and she said, and she was looking for a book to read to take to Hawaii. And she said to me jokingly, "Why can't you write a book I can read at the beach?" What she was implying was I only write scholarly books. And I remember thinking to myself, "Oh, you don't think I can write a beach book?" I said, "I can write a beach book. I'll show you. I'll write a beach book." Anyway, American Knees became my beach book. And this particular section I'm going to read is about that separation between Raymond and Aurora, who are the two main characters. It's from a chapter called Sleepwalking. At first, their parting, their separation, their movement away from each other was not absolute and final. They accepted each other on ever-changing terms, broke down barriers, reset borders, traveled together, shared unspoken regrets, made agreements, and made love for the last time several times. There was time and distance between them. Each time they got together, each of them measured and gauged the silence between them. Each time was a kind of starting over. Both of them experienced a weightlessness when their relationship ended, making them friends instead of lovers. There was a formality in the asking of a favor, making an appointment, seeking advice. And with acceptance or resignation, their answer, their gratefulness, was without pride, without hope of a return to the way lovers speak. Was it possible to understand what specific kindness was friendship rather than condescension? or genuine sentimentality rather than emotional fatigue. They both wondered if they were going forward. If they were, was there a brink out there on the horizon? Was the field flat now? Which one was pushing, or leading, or waiting? Was it impossible to fall? It was what Aurora became after Raymond left that split their image, divided her from him, separated cultures as if they had mixed blood with paint. She called it identity in her photographs. They documented her time without him and took possession of anything that he had left behind. They captured sound, recalled conversations, and understood or explained her half-Japanese, half-white familial roots. In one of her photographs, a porcelain headdress fell to the ground during a fitful sleep. It shattered. She had titled it, His Absence. His absence pulled her at first into the vacuum, the space where he had been. His absence later defined her, gave her black and white images, sound and touch as well as shape. Her voice told a story of a teardrop falling into a pan of hot oil, a jade bracelet knocking against a hot iron, a bucket clanging against the side of a well. After each departure, less and less of his presence remained in her home, until all the space he had once occupied became hers. Every woman she saw became a symbol for the place she occupied, the home she defined around herself, the roots that she set down. She saw herself span several generations. She was a woman who wrung out a shirt between two strong hands, a woman who plunged a cleaver into the breast of a chicken, a woman who pulled open an iron door and took a heated stone from beneath a fire-heated brick bed and slept with the warm stone on her belly on a warm night. She was a woman who scolded a child and watched a tear fall into a pan of hot oil and pop in the heat.